Hey folks, it's Mike Sylvester again from Core Essentials with another video. In my last video I talked about, in the context of strength training, the importance of knowing the different types of muscles, tonic versus phasic, and the different characteristics they have. For those of you that didn't see it, I encourage you to watch it on my YouTube page. Just search The Fitness Docs on YouTube. I basically discussed the tonic muscles are essentially postural in nature and are designed more for sustaining contractions at low loads for longer periods of time. They are more designed for holding postures like an isometric contraction for 1, 2, or even 3 minutes. They are built more for stability since they only span across one joint. I also talked about phasic muscles, which span across more than one joint. So they are built more for movement. They can sustain heavier loads and can move loads or resistance through a greater range of motion. These muscles are more superficial, unlike the tonic muscles that are deep and are often considered core muscles. Today, I want to talk about applying the knowledge of phasic and tonic muscles to stretching. My goal today is to hopefully convince you that the accepted protocols of traditional stretching are not all rooted in the basis of muscle physiology. To achieve this, I'm going to be discussing some pretty intricate anatomy and physiological concepts that are at times challenging to grasp, but essential for understanding the bone of contention I have with the current methodology regarding stretching. I'll do my best to scale it down and hopefully not butcher physiology. On my next lecture, I'll offer some alternative approaches to stretching based on principles that have been around for almost a century now and have either been ignored or bastardized. I'll also talk about core activation and its influence on releasing tightness in muscles. Let's get started. Has this ever happened to you? You're walking down the street and all of a sudden you feel like you're going to roll your ankle, but you catch yourself. You catch yourself. How does that happen? Unfortunately, some people don't catch themselves and they get what they call an inversion sprain. But for the most part, a lot of people know what I'm talking about. You're ready to roll the ankle and then you quickly bring it back into neutral so you don't sprain the ankle. What is going on a physiological level? Well, first we have to think about protection. The body is always on protection. What's it trying to protect? Overstretching of those muscles on the outside of the ankle. So the body has this system with these receptors that are in the muscles that communicate with the central nervous system and actually cause the muscle to contract, and it puts it back into neutral. We call that the stretch reflex. So the ability that these receptors can send the signal back to the central nervous system and back into the muscle to cause it to contract, to put that foot back into neutral. That ability to do that is called proprioception. And you don't even have to see your foot. It just happens on a kind of an automatic response. That's what we call the stretch reflex. And there's many receptors in the body. In the case of today, we're going to talk about a specific proprioceptor called the muscle spindle. And the muscle spindle's main job is to actually monitor changes in length. And it sends that information back to the central nervous system, and it processes it fast and brings it back to the muscle and causes it to contract and go back into neutral. That happens within 1 to 2 milliseconds. It's amazingly fast. It's called the stretch reflex. Some people may know it as the myotatic reflex, but that's what I want to talk about today, is the stretch reflex. And we need to know this foundation in order to get into the different types of stretching that I'm going to challenge today, and talk about a lot of other different types of stretching methods. That'll be on the next lecture. But today, basically, we're going to unpack this a little further, this stretch reflex, and talk about the differences between tonic muscles and phasic muscles. They can be stretched, they should be stretched differently. They should have different strategies in order to stretch them. And I haven't seen anything that talks about this. And I learned this back years ago, and I decided to unpack it today. Let's go a little further now and unpack what I just talked about. So I'm going to do my best to actually go over all the components of this diagram without butchering physiology, and at the same time hoping that I can get my point across about how this system works. Now again, we're going over this in detail. People may say why, is because this is the foundation of what we're going to talk about next, about training or stretching different tonic versus phasic muscles. This is important to know first. Okay, that's why we're going over this. So try to bear with me. Okay, I'm going to break it down. So on this side of the diagram here is the muscle. Okay, let's just start there. This side of the diagram is a cross section of the spinal cord. All right, these are constantly communicating. Spinal cord and the muscles. All right, now we can break the muscle down further into what we call the extrafusal fibers, which are right here. Those are on the outside. And most people are familiar with the outside of the muscle. That's the part that attaches to the tendon, and the tendon attaches to the bone, and that's what causes contraction. That's what causes the bone to move, and that's what causes locomotion, movement. Okay? So maybe we're still talking about the peroneal muscles, the muscles on the side of the ankle. Okay, those are the muscles that would possibly be put on stretch. So we're just making believe that this is the peroneal muscles, or the outside of the ankle. Okay. So what people may not be aware of is there's an internal portion of the muscle, and we call that intrafusal fibers. That's the inside, and that inside of the muscle is called the muscle spindle. It's one of many proprioceptors in the body. We're not going to talk about other things today, like the Golgi tendon organ. That's a different lecture. But today we're talking mostly about this muscle spindle, okay? Hopefully everybody's with me so far. So we get the extrafusal fiber, the part that attaches to the bone, causes the contraction. And then inside, what we talked about is the muscle spindle main function is to monitor changes in length, okay? And the muscle spindle can be further broken down into two other components, a nuclear bag fibers, and then this nuclear chain fibers. They have different roles, okay? The nuclear bag fibers are associated with changes in length and the rate or velocity of how fast that change occurs. Nuclear bag, okay? The nuclear chain, on the other hand, is more associated with sustained length. If it's sustained long enough, we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about what happens, okay? But for now, we're talking about nuclear bag, more associated with changes in length and velocity, how fast that happens, and that's important when we're talking about stretch reflex. I would imagine you understand that after everything I talked about. And then the nuclear chain is more associated with sustained length. Now, there has to be a way to communicate with the central nervous system. So we have these sensory nerve fibers that you see, one of them here in yellow. It's called the primary 1A. It goes to the spinal column. And then those are both attached to the bag and the chain, as you can see here, okay? And they're going, a stimulus has occurred, okay? Meaning the ankle has almost sprained, it's a change in length. That's the stimulus. Now there has to be a response too. We're going to get into that in a second. But so here's the primary 1As that goes to the spinal column. We're going to get into that in a second. And then there's another sensory nerve fiber called the secondary type 2s that kind of get squelched in this whole stretch reflex model. They're not as front and center as the primary 1As, which you're going to see in a second, okay? So, we get this stretch. Our ankle's ready to roll. There's a change in length. The main job of the spindle is to monitor changes in length, and especially this nuclear bag fibers, they're going to actually really get set off. So it sends the signal via a primary 1A sensory neuron, we call it afferent, away from the muscle to the central nervous system, and it bifurcates here. If you can see that, it bifurcates. The first one here, as you can see, it's not colored in, so it causes, that means it's facilitatory, it's stimulated, it's going to be turned, it's going to turn the muscle on. It sends a signal via a alpha motor neuron, efferent nerve fiber, sends it back to the extrafusal fibers. It came from the intrafusal fibers, and it's going to the extrafusal fibers, and it causes the muscle to contract. Brings it back to neutral. Unbelievable, okay? But something else has to happen as well when we're doing this. If you notice, this bifurcates over here. And now, if this muscle is contracting on the outside of the ankle, the perineals, as we talked about the muscle, the inside of the ankle has to lengthen to accommodate for that quick contraction. So we have to have lengthening on the inside of the ankle. And that's what this is going on here. This interneuron actually helps this sensory neuron communicate with this efferent nerve fiber, and that sends a signal to the opposite muscle, the inside of the ankle, what we call the tibialis anterior and the tibialis posterior, and that causes the muscle to relax. So when one muscle relaxes, and the other muscle, in this case the muscle on the inside relaxes, and the outside of the ankle contracts, stretch reflex, we call that reciprocal inhibition. Because if they both contract, it would be chaotic. So one muscle has to relax while the other muscle contracts. That is what's going on during this whole stretch reflex. And this is not really involving the brain. It's so fast, like I said, 1 to 2 milliseconds. It's really quick. And it's made to be quick. And it's made primarily, like we said, we didn't even talk about the secondary type 2s because this overrides them. It reacts to high, fast velocity rate. So those muscles, the primary 1As are the primary ones that are involved in this stretch reflex, like I say here. Okay? So that is the stretch reflex. All right, we're on to the best part of this lecture. We had to go over this stretch reflex to get to where we're going to in this part of the lecture here, which is differentiating stretches between the tonic strategy for stretching a tonic muscle versus stretching a phasic muscle. They are different, folks. But one thing I want to point out that I left out deliberately, and it doesn't mean it's not important. It is. It's called alpha gamma coactivation. I didn't talk about it here, and I'm not going to talk about it on the thing I'm going to talk about now on the tonic versus phasic. But it is important. I just didn't want to lose my audience. I want to keep pace with you guys, okay? So let's go on to this board, and we're going to talk about the primary 1A's influence on a tonic muscle, as well as a secondary type 2 influence on a tonic muscle. As you can see, there's 2 diagrams here, and that'll become important when I show you the next blackboard, okay? So if we want to stretch a tonic muscle, let's say the quads, or more specifically the vasti, the muscles of the thigh. If we want to stretch them, you see people doing stuff like this, okay? Stretching the quad. So it's a single joint muscle. It's a tonic, we know that. It reacts to sustained changes in length and responds well to sustained changes in length, and you'll see that in a second. So let's first go over what happens when the primary 1A actually, you sense a stretch in the muscle, in the vasti, the muscles in the front of the thigh. And that is sensed by the spindle, a change in length, right? We're sensing a change in length. So it sends the signal via an afferent nerve, sensory nerve, into the central the spinal column. It bifurcates here, we'll talk about that in a second, sends the signal back via an alpha motor neuron to the extrafusal fibers. It causes the muscle to contract. It turns on the muscle. That's primary 1A's influence on the muscle. Remember, it's attached to the bag and chain, and it's basically quick changes in length it senses. But what if you hold that stretch for longer than 30 seconds, minute and a half, 2 minutes? Now, the secondary type 2 fibers will kick in on a tonic muscle. So now, spindle senses a change in length, sends the signal to the muscle, but it's been stretched for a while now. It's not a threat. They say, hey, I think we can relax. The type 2s actually now have an opposing effect than the primary 1A's. It actually causes the muscle to shut off if you hold it long enough, and it turns off the muscle. Turns off the vasty, and it turns on the hamstring. Okay, so that's the whole basis of holding a stretch for 30 seconds to a minute, or even longer. This is the concept, folks. This is it right here. All right, but what if we take the same information and we talk about a phasic muscle? Hamstrings. Remember we talked about it. Crosses more than one joint. It's built for large loads. We're talking about stretching now. We want to stretch the hamstring, okay? So if you notice, there's only one diagram here. And this diagram is both for the primary 1A's and the secondary type 2s. Okay? So let's look at the primary 1A's influence. Again, the spindle senses a stretch. Remember, the whole role of the spindle is to sense changes in length. It senses the changes in length in the hamstring. We're stretching the hamstring. Sends in the signal to the central nervous system, and then it sends it back to the muscle. It causes it to contract. Same thing as we talked about here. That's the same diagram. Okay? But this is different. This is different, okay? Look at this. See what I said that turns off? The secondary fiber, if you hold the stretch long enough, it still turns on the muscle. It can't shut this muscle off, this two-joint muscle. People out in the hallways having a good time. Anyway, so it reinforces the primary 1A's, the secondary type 2 neurons, and that is on a hamstring, on a phasic muscle. So how do we shut this guy off? How do we shut a phasic muscle off? We can't use the same strategies, folks, as we do with a tonic muscle, okay? So next lecture, we're gonna talk a little bit about more on the strategies, and believe it or not, the core, activating the core can really bypass a lot of this stuff, and we're gonna get into that on the next lecture. But this is, real quickly, we're gonna talk about this type of stretching. I'm not gonna talk into detail, but basically, we've seen people have their shoulder on somebody's ankle or shin, calf, and they're trying, the participant here is, or the trainee is pushing down on this person's shoulder, okay? That's gonna cause the hamstring to contract. And if it contracts at a high tension level, it actually shuts down. And that's the reason why that happens is because we have to talk about another proprioceptor called the Golgi tendon organ. The Golgi tendon organ, instead of sensing changes in length, it actually senses increased tension. So it's protection. If it's gonna increase too much tension, it shuts down. That's the basis of this person doing this stretch. But it's bastardizing a concept called PNF, which we'll get into in our next lecture. I'm not gonna talk about it today. But even if we're gonna do this version, this bastardized version, it would be better to actually strengthen the hip flexors, the muscles in the thigh, in the front of the thigh here, because is it the hamstring that's tight or is it the hip flexors that are weak? if the hip flexors are tight, are weak, excuse me, if the hip flexors are weak, the hamstring's never going to see the light of day in that range, because this muscle is not strong enough for the hamstring to actually enjoy that mobility. So we're going to get into different types of stretching that goes beyond this elementary version of PNF, which is I call this bastardized PNF. But next time we're going to talk about strategies to turn these hamstrings off and find out the reason why, which is more important, the hamstring got tight in the first place. And we're going to talk about that next time. Stay tuned, folks.